Hello and welcome to this latest edition of Reality Check. Now, my guest today is someone I've been wanting to talk to for years because he shares very similar views to mine. And the thing I love about him is he's a scientist. He's a real scientist. He's somebody who's prepared to objectively and incisively engage with the topic of UAPs, no matter the taboo or the stigma. His name is Dr. Michael Masters. He's a tenured professor, no less, and he's a professor of biological anthropology at Montana Tech University in Butte, Montana. He received a PhD in anthropology from the Ohio State University in 2009, where he specialized in hominin evolutionary anatomy, archaeology, and biomedicine. And his recent research posits the idea that UFOs and aliens could be us, future humans. And the reason this resonates with me is because, as Michael actually reports in some of his papers, I've been told by people in the intelligence community that this is a theory we should take very seriously indeed. But even more interestingly, as well as publishing three excellent books, he's published one in 2019 called Identified Flying Objects, a multidisciplinary scientific approach to the UFO phenomenon. Another one called the Extraterrestrial model, which was published in June 2022, which looks at his time travel theory with a focus on abductee and contactee accounts. He's also written, God help him, he's an overachiever, a novel, The Revelation, The Future Human Past, which was published in June 2023, which digs deeper into this intertemporal hominin descendants question, but in the context of a science fiction novel. And most recently, Dr. Masters is one of the authors of a Harvard research paper, yet to be peer-reviewed, which suggests that life forms from other worlds could be living underground or undersea on this planet, or perhaps even on the moon, and that the UAPs being seen by many folks may be evidence of their presence here. Michael, welcome. Please, firstly, give me a bit of an idea about yourself. What stimulated your passion in the subject of UAPs? Why have you gone down this rabbit hole, this lunatic subject, which I'm sure does your academic career no good at all?
Yeah, that's a great question. And Ross, it's so great to talk to you. Followed your work as well for a very long time and appreciate you having me on. Apologize for the poorly timed drink there. I should have maybe taken that earlier. Yeah, no, that's a great place to start. It's been sort of a long and winding road, so to speak. I first got interested in this at a very young age after hearing a UFO account that came from my father, of all places. So I was sort of forced to start thinking about these things in real terms. It wasn't just what you see on TV and movies and science fiction, but someone I knew and trusted was now saying this is real and described his account. And it was a pretty typical nighttime encounter. He had a colleague with him, so there's more validity to it. It can be cross-checked by someone else. And that piqued my interest. It apparently piqued his as well because he got Whitley Strieber's classic book Communion. And I remember very vividly that I was sitting up on the living room shelf facing out toward the living room. I walked in from the dining room and looked up there and had sort of this image pop in my head, for lack of a better word. It was accompanied with sort of some thoughts, some information, some light was involved somehow. Still not really sure how that works into all of it. But so basically, I pictured an early hominin form with a prognathic face and a retracted forehead, a modern human, and then this archetypal gray alien on the cover of Whitley's book, and instantly wondered, could we be related? There were just an overwhelming number of characteristics that were similar, what I've come to know as synapomorphies or homologies, shared derived characteristics that seem to indicate that we may have a common ancestor on this planet. And over time, I went to investigate this further. I started out in physics and astronomy in my undergraduate years, and then shifted into biological anthropology to look more at the physical form of these beings, seen in association with the craft, and that's been my focus ever since.
So it's always struck me, you're absolutely right. It's always struck me there's a bit of a humanoid bias in our science fiction. I was a keen fan in my youth, as I'm sure you were, of Doctor Who and Star Trek. And of course, the aliens were always humanoid. They always had two arms and two legs, maybe with a few tentacles here and there. Are we getting it wrong? In evolutionary biology, it's utterly implausible, isn't it, that other beings, other intelligent beings on other planets would necessarily have evolved to a humanoid shape.
Right, absolutely. And that was kind of the main focus of my first book. I'm not trying to do a straw man fallacy here and tear down the extraterrestrial model. It's been intuitive, and it's been a part of the cultural zeitgeist, and maybe even throughout antiquity, because it makes sense. We see these stars, they're these mysterious objects in the sky. We see these craft coming down from the stars, and it makes sense why we would attribute these machines to those stars. So the extraterrestrial hypothesis intuitively has dominated the way we think about these things and the beings inside. And we do have to be careful too of the cultural, psychological, socio-cultural hypothesis that we're just imposing that on these encounters because it's what we know in ourselves, and we have to wonder if other civilizations could be leaving their home planet in the same way that we have been since the 1960s. So certainly we need to keep all these things in mind, but consistently, time and time again, you're right, they're described as upright walking hominin forms. And I really tried to make a case in my first book that it's not likely we would get that on a separate planet with a different distance from its sun, with different gravity, especially. And that's an important one I focus on in this book and in a lot of lectures I give, is that we are the only upright walking mammal on this planet. Think about that for a second. Like, some do it temporarily. Chimpanzees will walk upright when they're trying to scare other chimps in the group or hoard food, carry offspring. We're the only ones that are upright walking. We suffer from all kinds of problems because of it. And Earth is tremendously small relative to other planets. From some calculations I did in 2016, about 2.5% of all planets that have been discovered at that time were the same size as or smaller than Earth. So if bipedalism, the trait that defines the hominin lineage, is so rare here, it's likely to be even rarer on other Earth-like exoplanets. And I redid this study with new data from Kepler mission and other studies through NASA, and the number went up slightly, but it was still under 4%. So not just that, there's a lot of other traits. We have bilateral symmetry, two gut openings, eyes, nose, mouth in the same place, four limbs,
Well,
which makes us
slow down a bit there,
tetrapods.
because I'm interested in this stuff. So just explain to our audience. Obviously, there's the bipedal issue. Just explain to me again, the placement of eyes. What is it about the unlikelihood of aliens being humanoid bipedal that leaps out at you? Just talk me through that evolutionary biological issue, because I'm fascinated by this and I hadn't thought about it until I read your book.
Yeah, me too. That's maybe why I got really excited there and just started throwing everything out really fast, because
Yeah, because I
it
want to pin
excites
you
me
down.
too.
I'm really interested in this stuff and I want to hear some of that detail.
Yeah, so it is really interesting. About 6 to 8 million years ago, we shared a common ancestor with what would go on to become chimpanzees and all of these other hominin forms. But what really launched us in that direction is that we did stand upright. It's a very simple behavioral shift. There's a lot of explanations for why that happened. Some center on biomechanics, that it was beneficial for long distance walking and running because you use less energy on two limbs than you do on four. It may have helped us in the hot summer sun of East Africa to have less of our body exposed to the sun, help us see over grasses. The trees were starting to dwindle about 3 to 4 million years ago, so we could see predators coming, get up into those trees quicker if we're standing upright, look more intimidating. There's a lot of explanations for potentially why this happened. We can't know until we have a time machine if we could go back that far, because this was a behavioral change. But we can see in the morphological form of these ancestors that we did stand upright. We know that happened. It set us on this trajectory that led to our uniqueness. We could attribute a lot of our sort of specialized, what we call derived characteristics, to just standing up. Our heads had to rotate down, which meant our basic cranium became flexed, and it increased our brain size, especially in the frontal lobe. Another unique characteristic is we're the only mammal that has the brain sitting right on top of the eyes. And when I'm not doing weird UFO stuff, that's the main thing that I look on, is how does it affect vision in a functional sense with regard to our expanding neurocranium and also our reduced and retract mid and lower facial anatomy. What does that do? Does it impinge on the eyes that may be related to juvenile onset myopia and astigmatism, which is increasing tremendously in humans, especially in East Asia, where 80 to 90% of the population has juvenile onset myopia. So all of these traits using our hands, being able to build things, being able to create, being able to make computers and type on computers and make tools and fire, all of these were allowed for simply by standing up.
So your point is that let's look at the grey alien, the classic Whitley Strieber alien being that's cast from numerous witnesses. There are so many people who've described this phenomenon. Whatever it is they're describing, there's a consistency. It's a humanoid, 2 eyes, nose, ears, very, very similar structure to ours. And so you posit that it's more likely than not they're us from the future. Just talk me through why you say that.
Sure. So to circle back to a couple of things when I got all excited and was throwing out anatomical terms, we can go back 400 million years to when we shared a common ancestor with tetrapods. And even though it's not ideal, Darwin pointed this out in the 1850s, it's not ideal to have the same four-limb structure to do all of these different things. Elephants would be better off with 6 legs or 8 legs, for instance, because of their body weight. So, but we have taken that. We've have this highly conserved biomechanical trait of having 4 limbs. On those 4 limbs are 5 digits, and they're used in a lot of different ways. Even if you look at a horse's hoof, you can still see remnants, vestigial remnants of these other parts of the 5-finger pentadactyl anatomy. So you keep going forward. Once we stood upright and we became the only upright walking mammal on this planet, it ushered in all of those changes I was talking about. But there's such a unique evolution that happened that we see the same traits in these others, these visitors, as Whitley calls them, because he doesn't want to attribute any nomenclature to it. And all of us should be cautious of that. Even non-human intelligence is innately biased in that it says these are non-human, and they potentially may be human in some form of it. So even with regard to what happened to us since we became bipedal 6 to 8 million years ago, if you take this long trend in our craniofacial anatomy primarily, which is what I've studied throughout my career, if you look at these great aliens, they seemingly have a form consistent with the continued evolution of these traits, namely an increase in brain size, mediolateral expansion, what we call neurocranial globularity, a continued reduction and retraction of our mid and lower facial anatomy, smaller ears, more intelligence, better technology, potentially the ability to make technology that can allow us to travel backward in time. So there's these suite of characteristics associated with these others that seems to indicate that they're the continuation of what we call in anthropology biocultural evolution, that it's not just their biology evolving, but also the technology which feeds back into that. And you get kind of the self-licking ice cream cone or this runaway train of evolution caused by both our biology and culture changing in concert with one another.
Now, Michael, I want to take you into an area that I hope you're comfortable speaking about because I've been fascinated. I saw your interview with Jesse Michel's, and you spoke there about your own personal experience with the phenomenon. Can you talk me through what happened to you? I mean, firstly, I'm intrigued by the fact that so many people I speak to who share the passion that you have for investigating this issue of UAPs. They've had experiences in their family in the past. They've had relatives that have seen things. In your case, it was your dad. A lot of people have described to me having mums who were psychic or grannies who saw things or who knew things or talked about the little people. In your case, what I'm intrigued about is you've had your own personal experience with the paranormal.
Yeah, quite recently, actually. It's funny too because I started talking about all of this. I started writing my first book in 2012, and then I started talking publicly about all of this in 2018, ahead of the publication of my first book in 2019. And yeah, I had no idea what the response would be. I was pretty nervous about it because, as you mentioned in the intro, it's you're sort of committing potentially career suicide in talking about this stuff. It hasn't been the case, and we could get into that later if you'd like. It's been the opposite, in fact, which has been great to see. But I was always bummed out to some extent because people would always ask me, "Have you ever seen a UFO?" And I was like, "No, I never have. I've never had any strange experience." And then that all came to a head in 2022, and all kinds of strange things started happening at the same time. Um, but yeah, to your
Like
to
what?
your question, well, I did finally see UFOs, 5 at the same time. That was sort of one of the first forays into high strangeness. I hadn't I looking back after some of these other things, I have identified points where things did happen, but I didn't have the bandwidth and the experience to recognize what was happening. But there's some clarity now in hindsight, looking back at some very strange things. But the UFOs that I saw, the five,
I just want to, can I just walk you through this? Do you think that whatever they were, those objects were showing themselves to you to twig your consciousness?
yeah, a big part of what 2022 was is a wake up call. I I wasn't paying attention in the way I should to the things that were happening all around me. And we can get into the really weird experience that I talked about with Jesse. And that was very much an intentional physical face to face, hey, pay attention. This is happening. We need you to recognize that. And it really messed me up for a while, but it's since gotten better. But yeah, the 5 UFOs I saw were right up in the sky near my house above what's called the East Ridge here in Butte, Montana, and they were hovering. I feel like I was kind of taken up there. There's no reason why I should have walked up this hill behind my house, but when I did, I turned around, boom, there they were. And they were just sitting there, and one by one, from right to left, they were in formation. They just shot off toward the southeast at tremendous speed. And after that, not long after that, just before I went to a conference at Rice University to be on a panel with a number of really amazing people looking at some of these same sorts of questions, I felt like, and this is where I start to sound like a crazy person. So I just like to preface the next couple of things I say with I am aware of that. These things did happen. I don't expect anyone, to some of them, it's not even about belief because other people were involved. So there's corroboration that can take place. This first one was just me and what felt like a telepathic conversation I was having with a very bright security light in my neighbor's yard. So take that for what it's worth. But the reason I mention it is because I felt like it was a back and forth, and I asked a question that later was brought up in this face-to-face communication that also involved telepathy. And toward the end of it, I realized were the same entities I was communicating with through that light, or they were communicating with me through this light, or vice versa, I guess. So yeah, that came after the UFOs. And then the main one that I guess you're talking about that I talked to Jesse with was yeah, I was taken into a room by a person, a normal human being, as I came to learn, who then brought another person who I didn't know at all. I'd never met before. And just prior to this, right before I went to this conference, I was washing dishes and I thought to myself, I'm done with this. I don't want to do this anymore. I was traveling for conferences, for TV shoots, documentaries, and I was just exhausted. I was burnt out. As you're well aware, there's a number of trolls that occupy this space, and we're constantly being trolled by ignorant people that hide behind fake accounts and live in their mom's basement, most likely.
Yeah, yeah,
So
yeah,
I was just
yeah,
over
yeah.
all of it.
I admire
Yeah.
your courage in that regard, Michael, by the way. I really do. I mean, there is a snide, nasty sewer rat quality of human being that likes to prey on anybody that wants to scientifically engage with this subject. Sorry, keep on going.
Yeah, no, well said. I like that. Yeah, there's a lot of obstacles, you know, and I am fortunate and I feel blessed that I haven't had to deal with a lot of backlash with regard to my colleagues, with regard to my institutional colleagues and outwardly, and, you know, these various fields that I talk about in my first book. I'll take sewer rat trolls all day over, you know, my actual colleagues who I know and respect, saying things like that. Not that they ever would, because they have humility, and we're all in this together. We all have a sense that we're trying to unravel these mysteries. So anyway, I decided I wanted to quit. I just thought that as I'm washing dishes. My wife's sitting right behind me on my couch. This was kind of a big life change, but I didn't feel like talking about it, so I didn't say anything to her. So when these two people brought me onto this balcony at a hotel in Mesa, Arizona, and I think it was October 14th, 2022, just a couple years ago, this person comes in, this man whose name I know now, and he wouldn't mind me saying it, Eric Mitchell is his name, but I'd never met him, never seen his face, had no idea who he was. He comes in to this on this balcony where I'm sitting, pulls his chair up right in front of mine to where his face is right here, and says, I can tell this is upsetting you, but we need to be this close for this to work. And then all of that anger just kind of faded away. But the next thing is what really jump started this wake up call for me to pay attention. He said, we know you've been thinking about quitting lately, but we'd really prefer you not do that yet. So to have a complete stranger who's sitting inches from your face tell you a thought that was in your head that you never spoke out loud to anyone, never wrote down,
So
was
he's not
very
talking to you
much.
at this stage. This is totally telepathic.
No, and it wasn't even him. It wasn't him. It's I've researched this a lot. The best I can describe it is what's called a deep trance mediumship, where his brain is unique. He had a UFO experience that was really, really intense and changed his brain morphology. It changed him as a person. But so they were speaking through him, they're using him as an antenna. And I get the sense that we're all antennas, that we're all sort of doing this constantly. But this was an intervention. This was very much, this person was brought here, his brain, his body, and hers. Heidi's was being used too, the woman that, and they'd never met before either. They knew each other, but they'd never met. So both of them were used and brought to this place to do this thing that we can get into if you'd like. But that was, hey, pay attention. We know your thoughts. We know you're thinking about quitting. Please don't do that yet.
I'm blown away by this because you're not the first person to tell me about these kind of approaches from what sounds like a non-human intelligence wanting in some way to push people to continue to investigate. So tell me a little bit more. You say there's more to this story. Neither of the two people who were in the room or on the balcony with you at the time were the entities or the intelligences that were communicating with you. Talk me through what was happening and what you think was going on in reality.
Yeah, and you know, it was really hard to talk about this for a year. Jesse was the first person I talked to about it because I know him. He's a friend. I knew I could trust him to, you know, do a good job and help people recognize that I don't have schizophrenia. I'm not crazy. This did actually happen. And so, um, like I said, I knew Heidi. I knew she was a person. I'd interacted with her 3 years prior at the same event. This Eric person, I didn't know. I assumed he was some kind of future human because that's the very next thing. Is I said, "How do you know that? How do you know this thought in my head?" And telepathically, I responded, "Future humans." Well, they said, "Once you know who we are, you'll know how we know this." I responded, not using my mouth, which I didn't even know I could do at that time. Future humans? Question mark. And they said, "So you know how we did this?" I said, "Uh-huh, I guess." But it is important, and I've tried to make a point of this when I talked about it in New York at a conference recently. They didn't say yes. And I think that's an important caveat. They didn't say, yes, we are future humans. They just moved on and said, so you know how we did this. So I don't feel comfortable talking about origins. And in fact, with all of this, I'm not trying to tell anybody what to think about it. I'm just conveying what happened in these moments and how it ties together. But I leave it open for all to interpret because I don't understand it either. I'm still trying to figure it out myself. Um,
After the exchange, was Eric or Heidi aware that they'd had this transmedium communication?
Heidi was aware something had happened, something very strange. She couldn't remember the details of what was said and what was communicated. I didn't know Eric existed as a person outside of this. I didn't know anything about him, and I was afraid to try to find out because it scared the crap out of me, to be honest, all of it. And I was really just messed up psychologically, emotionally for about 3 or 4 weeks after. But once Jesse's doco came out, I got a Facebook message from Eric, and it was really jarring because his Facebook profile picture. I was sitting at Thanksgiving dinner, actually, about to eat, and I get a messenger alert, and it pops up, and it's this kind of psychedelic background and his haunting eyes that were just 4 inches from my face during this whole encounter, and it triggered me. I started sweating and kind of the chills because he's a person and I've gotten to know him. He's a great person and I've learned a lot from him, and he still channels stuff occasionally, which is kind of crazy. Even after all of this has happened, I would occasionally get things through him, not from him, but through him, through Facebook Messenger, written in sort of uh, just almost encrypted, cryptic ways, like it's Middle Aramaic or something. But it was clearly not from him because I have gotten to know him and know how he talks, but things would come through, occasionally things I'm thinking. I was just in bed one night thinking about something, and this message comes through related to that thing I was thinking about in the context of how I was thinking about it. So I'm jumping all over the place here. I apologize,
No, no,
but
no, no. I'm fascinated by this. Can I ask, and I'm not going to tell you why I'm asking this, is there a color associated with this?
well, as the conversation progressed and we started to get into why they were there beyond simply asking me to please not quit, there were other things that happened in between. But once they started downloading information into my brain, there were a lot of colors. I think of it almost as like fiber optics, how the colors come through as the steady stream, this really fast, intense stream of colors. The ones that jump out the most were blue and purple for some
Oh
reason.
my God.
I don't know
I was
why.
waiting for you to say that.
Nobody's ever asked,
Blue.
actually. This is the first time I've ever had to think
No, no,
about
no.
it,
This
but
this really sends you just sent a slightly PTSD chill up my spine, Michael, because um, I know this will set everybody off. I'll probably cop those trolls yet again and bugger them if I do. Um, I am being contacted from all over the world by people saying they're in contact with blue beings. And the color blue, why I have the color blue behind me here. The color blue is a very dominant theme in what they talk about. And I'm when you used the word downloads before, that also sent a shiver up my spine because again, there are people who are describing to me how they are literally having the capacity to understand suddenly, simultaneously, without any educational training,
yeah,
complex mathematical formulae in downloads. Have you heard of that happening?
I have. Yeah. And I can't help but wonder, the more I've sort of tried to examine what, not just what's happened to me, but put it in the context of other people's experiences. And that was the whole focus of my second book, was what can we learn by looking for patterns across a lot of people's experiences, is what we call an abductive approach, where you look for the most plausible scenario, inference to the best explanation. And yeah, I'd heard that the color's interesting. I hadn't thought about that. I'm glad you mentioned it because now it's another little rabbit hole to go down. But I have very much had conversations with a lot of people, especially over the last 6 months or so since Jesse's doco came out. People reaching out to me talking about similar experiences, downloads they've had. None of it included two people standing the way that these two people were standing. But yeah, the thing though is I've started to dissolve in my mind, or it's been forced to be slightly changed, or I've been forced to reconceptualize reality as somewhat more malleable and perhaps emergent from a deeper rooted, energetic, electromagnetic, consciousness based reality that is all around us all the time. And so when people talk about blue beings, is that related to this? Is the blue that I saw during this telepathic communication somehow related to what people are seeing in a physical form, but at the heart of it, maybe it's an aspect of the electromagnetic spectrum? I don't know. I'm just spitballing here, but my point is, what I am trying to say in a very roundabout way is that when people see a blue being, maybe it's not the being itself, but the energy that emanates from that, or how they perceive the energy.
Exactly. Wow. I have to admit, the profundity of what you've just said there is shocking to me because of a whole series of people that I'm in touch with who completely out of the blue will contact me. And a lot of them talk about blue energy, blue light, and in some cases, blue beings. But all of them are talking about downloads and twigging of consciousness. And a lot of them have been prodded like you have. A lot of them are scientists, defense people, intelligence people, telling me that even though they try and ignore it, there's something that's goading their consciousness and prodding them to keep on taking an interest in this issue. I must say, there's two things I take a benevolent and happy message from your theory, which is we seem to survive as humans. If they are future humans, even though they're slightly odd looking, it means that at least some humans managed to survive whatever apocalypse might be ahead of us and breed and make babies and evolutionary change in the way that they have done. So let's come to that. I mean, your paper, the Harvard paper you've most recently been a part of, which is essentially exploring a so-called cryptoterrestrial hypothesis. I want to get into it, but first I just want to ask you, I saw it went up on ResearchGate, which is an online scientific paper publication platform, but it's been taken down. And Newsweek, I noticed, were they gloating? They asserted that it was taken down after they published their article about it. Was your paper taken down? And if so, why?
It was taken down briefly for maybe 2 hours tops. And yeah, of course, Newsweek is going to say that to try to have some sense of self-importance. And honestly, out of the the many articles I've read, theirs was maybe the least accurate to start with. So of course they said that and tried to make it a thing, and it wasn't. If they had done any sort of due diligence in their journalism, they would have realized the paper was back up in a very short period of time. They would have had to change their link, but it was back up. So it was taken down for about 2 hours for a couple of reasons. One of the main ones was that there was a very small grammatical error in the abstract. And we all went over this paper many, many times, and we're all sticklers for grammar. So it was sort of surprising it got past the three of us, to be honest. But people, especially when you're talking about something outside the ordinary that pushes at the boundaries of the circumscribed reality that we all find ourselves in, they'll latch on to something like a tiny grammatical error to try to just take away from everything else that was said in the paper. And so that was happening. So we pulled it down to fix that grammatical error, to add a slight disclaimer at the top, and then boom, it was right back up.
So you're not
But
being
yeah,
nobbled. Nobody's nobbling you. There was no attempt to shut down your research. Let's go then into the subject of this crypto-terrestrial hypothesis. You're basically suggesting, as I understand it, that it might not be extraterrestrial, i.e., off this planet, whatever this intelligence is, that it might be here already, perhaps some kind of remnant of an ancient civilization that grew up beside us on this planet. Just talk me through the hypothesis as you've explained it.
yeah. So, well, I would preface that by saying not just extraterrestrial. So we do consider extraterrestrial as a potential explanation for the origins of these advanced beings that are sequestering themselves in Earth's environs, but also add a lot of others that have been discussed previously. This isn't our idea. The cryptoterrestrial hypothesis is one amongst others: extraterrestrial, extraterrestrial, ultra-terrestrial. So we focused on this one in particular because there does seem to be, and just quickly to give a definition for your viewers who might not be familiar with this, is the idea behind the crypto terrestrial is it's something that's hiding. It's not in plain sight. It's sequestering itself. It's here. It's more advanced than us, but it doesn't overtly acknowledge itself to us at this time. Maybe it will in the future. Who knows? Maybe it does subtly. Maybe they walk amongst us. It is a potential possibility. And even with what happened to me in Phoenix, we kind of have to consider that as a walk amongst us scenario. Like, these individuals are people, but if their brains can be taken over by a more advanced consciousness, they're walking amongst us at whatever time they want in whoever's body they want. Sort of a strange love and light body snatcher scenario there. But so yeah, the whole
Were
idea
you
of the
nervous?
paper.
Were you nervous when you started venturing this hypothesis? I mean, obviously, one of the most vilified people in the world of ufology is a British guy called David Icke, who talks about reptilian lizards running the world. You know, the royal family are apparently lizards of some kind. Isn't there a risk if you even dip your toe into this subject matter, you're going to get sucked down that rabbit hole of what people assert are rabid conspiracy theories?
Yeah, absolutely. But I mean, that kind of goes for any of the many branches that stem from the tree of the phenomenon and high strangeness in general, but especially with regard to UFOs, when you start talking about origins and intent. But it wasn't just him. I mean, Mac Tawney's wrote a very good book that was published posthumously. I'm sure, he'd be very elated to see everything that's been happening because he wrote a book called The Cryptoterrestrials, which oddly is almost identical to my writing and both the style of writing, which kind of creeped me out when I was reading it, but also what we're saying. We've been saying almost the same thing. Just I added the dimension of time to it as an important variable, and he mentions it slightly, but it's not just people that are out there in right field, shoeless, drunk, saying whatever they want. And I'm not speaking to this ick person in particular, but yeah, the idea innately sounds crazy. And we recognize that. And we got out in front of it and stated in the abstract that this might be a hard pill to swallow for a lot of academics. And they should take it as a suppository instead, perhaps. We didn't actually say that,
There's
but that would have been kind of funny to put in there.
There's so much in your paper, this Harvard paper, that I loved. I mean, you've gone down a lot of the rabbit holes I'm fascinated with, notably theories and mythologies about ancient civilizations. But because we're in July and because it's the anniversary of Roswell, let's talk about the one you do mention about Shirley Wright, the Albert Einstein personal assistant, who was a young woman in 1947 who accompanied Albert Einstein, she said, late in her life in an interview that was released after her death. She came forward with evidence that Roswell was real, that it did involve the recovery of non-human craft technology, and that live aliens were indeed recovered and interviewed. And there was something I hadn't realized that you mentioned in your paper, that she suggested that what she learned with Albert Einstein at that encounter was that these beings were, quote, just humans, but an advanced form, which intrigued me. I mean, do you give plausibility to the Shirley Wright story?
Well, I do. I mean, it's always hard with these older accounts. Well, maybe it's not. We have the same rigors for assessing old accounts, new accounts. Obviously, we're not able to go back and give lie detector tests. Well, maybe we are, especially if she's right that these are more advanced future humans. But it's not just her either. It makes sense if you have this thing happen. Say there are other indications of other crashes too, but this one in 47, if you're trying to understand it, it's in the beginning stages of the nuclear age. We just dropped bombs on Japan. Who are you going to look to other than the most prominent, most intelligent people on this planet? Albert Einstein would certainly be at the top of that list. So it makes sense just in the context of who she worked with. And yeah, he would be putting himself at that time, especially in a position for potential career suicide if he said these things. She obviously would maybe be a little more protected in that he doesn't want to tarnish what is one of the best legacies of any scientist in history. So I do take that seriously, especially when we step back and look at it in the context of these other interactions and other deathbed confessions. Commander George Hoover, for instance, said the same thing, that these were future humans. Yes, this was real, and they looked like us, and they were more advanced. And he specifically stated they were future humans. She danced around it a little bit, and there's case after case. One thing I try to do in my second book at the beginning is show just how many other people have been talking about this future human idea as a plausibility in all of these different capacities. And you and I have been saying this for a very long time, coming from different perspectives. Yours more based in the IC And mine has overlapped there as well. I've had people from the intelligence community say, we've been talking about this idea for a while and it's being considered. And some people might even know within the intelligence community. And mine focuses on the biological side, but you also have people like Jack Sarfati on the physics side. So you take all of this, including the eyewitness testimony, including the people on their deathbeds who are confessing these things, and it should absolutely be considered. I've never stated, and I never would state that this explains all of the phenomena. It's too much weirdness. There's too much high strangeness involved and too much variation for it to be one thing. But that's also what we're trying to do with this crypto-terrestrial explanation is say they're hiding. But where are they from? And they could be extraterrestrial, they could be extratempestrial, they could be here after some sort of apocalypse or some sort of cataclysm that took place. The fairies, trolls, jinn, genie, all of these things are possible, but they're hiding.
You know, the thing that fascinates me, Michael, is when I was writing my book, I started going through the CIA library because a couple of intelligence people told me that I should read what had been declassified by the CIA. And I'm fascinated because there really was a study done by the CIA into Atlantis, and they did a research study in the 1960s. And, and, and you can find it in the CIA library where they basically spent public money. I mean, what the hell was a US intelligence agency doing, flying scientists around the world to investigate the location of Atlantis? And there's also, I mean, I've spoken to other people who are involved in Egyptology research, and they tell me that the CIA was very extensively involved in researching the pyramids and the suggestion that a large part of the ancient monuments of what is today modern Egypt cannot be explained by the known civilizations that have lived there, and that there may indeed be some precursor civilization. And this is where I got really excited when I was reading your paper, because it's essentially a conglomeration of all of the things I've been reading about over many, many years, the unexplained ancient civilizations on this planet. And there's one subject, we're going to run out of time if I try and cover everything that I want to do. But there's a subject that really sucked me in your article where you talk about out of place artifacts. And I'd never heard this before, but you mentioned how at the Kalambo Falls in Zambia, researchers discovered two pieces of wood clearly designed, shaped to interlock, that dated to 500,000 years ago. I'd never heard about that. Can you tell me about that?
That one was Tim as far as the details of it. He looked into a lot of these. There's a acronym for it, out of place. UPAs, I guess would be what that is. And yeah, we should absolutely consider these. I can't speak to that one. He went down that rabbit hole and pulled that one into the paper, but I have looked at a lot of other ones. I did a History Channel show last year where we looked at the oh, I can't remember the name of that one now either. Apparently that was a while ago
But
too.
there was one you also mentioned. There's a fossilized imprint of a wheel found in a Ukrainian coal mine nearly a kilometer underground, which was potentially dated as being 300 million years old. It all suggests the possibility that we are not the first civilization on this planet.
Well, it definitely should be considered. And yeah, there's the Silurian hypothesis that there could have been advanced civilizations whose remnants were destroyed through the ravages of time. And that obviously happens. The farther back in time you go, speaking archaeologically, the less available information there is. You have less data because of erosion, because of the tectonic plates, rifts, and volcanoes, and all of these things that move things around. We also have to be cautious of that, again, putting on my science hat, because it can confuse dates too. You can have something that is relatively recent that gets washed into a stratigraphic layer that dates to a time that's much older. So with that caveat in mind, it doesn't explain all of these. Some of them can be very accurately dated. So we should take those into account, especially when they're found in association with other things that help legitimize the provenience of them, how they fit with other artifacts at that time period, with the culture that may have made them. And yeah, there we would expect, if there are advanced civilizations that existed in our deep past that were wiped out for the most part in this Silurian hypothesis kind of way, that some do make it through, and that we find the remnants of those. And it may be an indication of some past civilization that could have existed, and maybe even in the context of Atlantis and the lore. And that's another thing I try to do in my second book too, is show that it's not just one thing. It's not just what we find. It's the whole suite of characteristics that make it through history and prehistory, the stories, the cave paintings, the oral legends, the myths that grow up around specific things. We can learn a lot from those. And when trying to understand the past, especially understanding the past in the context of high strangeness and the phenomenon, we should absolutely be looking at all of those. And that's largely what we were trying to do in this paper, is say, there's a lot of strange things in the past. There's a lot of potential origins for these advanced visitors, but let's be open-minded to the possibility of some of these and take it seriously and have a discussion. And in the title of the paper, we had openness to scientific discussion about these. And it's seemingly been doing that. And it's been great to see. And the conversations that have grown out of this, just speaking anecdotally from my experience, have been fundamentally different than they even were 5 years ago in talking about this stuff. People are taking it seriously. I think a lot of people are ready to kind of move past the cockpit videos and start talking about the origins and intent of these visitors.
The thing I find fascinating is a lot of the best work on this is being done out of the mainstream. And there's a default in mainstream media to go, oh, this is all rubbish. Graham Hancock's a lunatic. This ancient apocalypse theory is complete lunacy. We're not going to give this a run. And then he goes on Joe Rogan, and millions, tens of millions of people engage intellectually with the subject. And I sense there's a wisdom of the crowd here. And I was fascinated to read your account of these archaeological investigations into unexplained ancient civilizations. And just to name a few, there's along the Indus River at the sites of Harappa and Mohenjo-daro. There's lost to history for years, a civilization detected there with script and language that to this day is indecipherable. A whole civilization that's clearly not part of known Indian civilization, that predates that civilization, and we've just got no explanation for it. Then there's Göbekli Tepe, which is at least 11,000 years old in Turkey, humanity's oldest monumental structures, the world's first temple, and we don't even know who built that. And just running through very quickly, because I loved some of the examples you use in your paper. The 2007 discovery of a Stonehenge-like structure in Lake Michigan that's thought to be at least 10,000 years old. I didn't know this tidbit, but apparently there's an image of a mastodon, a large beast that roamed North America in the Pleistocene era 11,700 years ago, which implies there was some kind of civilization building monuments in America 11,700 years ago. And yet we don't know who these people were.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think you're right. Just to briefly touch upon what you said earlier with regard to the mainstream media not being a part of this yet. I think at some point their hands will be forced and they'll have to be. But really, a lot of these organizations, as you're well aware, where as a journalist, have sort of fulfilled the role of telling us what we're allowed to think about and when, and to provide us comfort. Hey, you can think about this in this way and it'll be comfortable and you don't have to challenge your worldview at all. But you're right, there is a, what was the word you used? Wisdom of the crowd, where people want something more than what they're giving. They're not willing to take the risk to talk about these things. Certainly some are. NewsNation certainly is one of those, as is Joe Rogan and other outlets as well. But people want this. People are ready for this conversation, and they're taking it seriously. I've done a number of interviews with folks in mainstream media outlets on CBS and Fox, and they to my surprise, were very grounded, informed questions that I was asked about this as they took it seriously. I might be played in with some X-Files music at the beginning, but very quickly the conversation turns to one of intrigue and a humility that we don't know everything. And I think that's one of the most important points. We all need to get there and realize that there's so much to this world and this reality that we just don't understand. And we can't just keep saying, well, that's impossible, I'm not going to look at it. Instead, we need to say, we don't understand what's possible. So let's look at it so we can start to understand that. And sorry, that was a bit of a tangent, but you're right. There are a ton of these sites that are sort of along those lines, challenging preconceived notions of time and space. Things are constantly being backdated to a previously bygone era that we didn't think they could have existed in that time. We used to think, for instance, Lascaux Cave was the oldest cave paintings, about 17,000 years ago. Now we know they go back to the time of Neanderthal, 65,000 years ago. And you're right, the mastodon carving in the bottom of Lake Michigan shows the people that were living there who had been there for possibly 10,000 years prior were engaged in artistic expression in a way we didn't fully understand. Göbekli Tepe is a great example of how we now see that temples were important and gathering people together for spiritual reasons even predated sedentism associated with agriculture. We thought it was the other way around, that people had to become sedentary and then they start making temples for worship. This flips that on its head. So as that keeps happening, yeah, we all need to embrace some humility and recognize that we don't have all of the answers with regard to archaeology, with regard to history, and with regard to the UFO phenomenon.
One of the things I wanted to explore with you, there's so much I didn't know, but because I've just come back from the New Mexico, Arizona area where I've been shooting a story, I'm fascinated with the mythology of the Native American peoples, particularly the Cheyenne people. And one of the things I didn't know was that you give credibility in your paper to the flood narrative that's part of an oral history across many cultures. The idea of a great flood that destroyed civilizations many, many thousands of years ago. It's in Sumerian, ancient Israelite, Greek, Indian, and to my surprise and shock, Cheyenne Native American oral history. Just explain that. I mean, how on earth would an indigenous people in North America possibly have known about a great flood on the other side of the world?
Yeah, well, that's a really great question. And I guess in my mind, I wonder if they were all concurrent. If a flood that's written about in biblical texts was at the same time as one that took place in the American Southwest, is at the same time as some of these other places where they documented it. If that was the case, yeah, you have to wonder if it was something that existed on a almost cosmic scale, one that's far beyond our knowledge, and if that's the way it was done for some purpose. Like yeah, to get into Graham Hancock's work, I don't as an archaeologist, it's hard for me to take everything he says as being legitimate. I highly critical actually of a lot of what he says, but when it comes to this question of resets, when it comes to this question of these apocalyptic scenarios where a lot of people die and there's a rebuilding, it seems to make sense. And there are things that are written about and described in oral tradition that would indicate that maybe there is some validity to that and it should be taken seriously. If you did have a concurrent flood, and let's just take these two places in the Middle East, in the Palestine region, and in the Southwest, where the Cheyenne, the Navajo, all of these various groups live, that's that's a global catastrophe. How that would even happen, I don't know, especially because at this time there's still more ice locked up in the ice caps. It had been melting since about 12,000, 15,000 years ago. So yeah, it's interesting to think about the logistics of that. But but these sort of cataclysms, these resets, I think, we should take that seriously. There are accounts in many biblical texts. It seems almost like we're on the precipice of one now. You mentioned earlier in this conversation that this part of this future human hypothesis gives you some sense of comfort because humanity does survive whatever's coming. And I think anyone who pays attention to the testimony of experiencers, that is a very common theme throughout everything is that there's something coming. There's something coming. Is it a shift in consciousness? Is it an actual physical cataclysm, an apocalyptic scenario? It's hard to say, but we should maybe be taking that seriously and focusing on these things that exist in history because we might be on the precipice of one ourselves.
You are interesting to me because you're an objective, disciplined scientist, but you've also had that twigging of your consciousness, that ontological shock posed by what appears to have been some kind of paranormal experience where something, perhaps a non-human intelligence of some kind, has engaged, you believe, telepathically with you, perhaps to twig your consciousness, to keep you doing your work. First question, do you think it's benevolent, whatever it is?
Yeah, I mean, that gets into a whole messy area of ethics and morals. And, as we do nice things to our dog at the vet, does it see us as evil creatures who are taking it to be probed and prodded? The interactions I have had with this highly advanced non-local consciousness, just to keep it general because I don't understand what it is, has been extremely your classic love and light Ryan Gosling on Saturday Night Live sort of scenario where it's very much, yeah, just a benevolence, a love, a caring. I was sort of almost taken out of my body during this experience for a slight period of time and brought into that world. And it's a lot like what people describe in near-death experiences, where you feel this all-encompassing embrace of yeah, just light and love and consciousness and empathy, importantly. But to sort of tie together what we had just been talking about with this issue too, and something I didn't mention earlier, because we sort of diverged in what we were talking about, but they needed to put three things in my brain that would come out at some future time. And I can't help but wonder if it is related to this impending thing that's coming. There was a sense of urgency to it. There was a sense of importance to it. I don't know what it was. They told me I wouldn't know. They asked my permission to tie back to what we're talking about now with regard to their intentions and are they benevolent. They were extremely polite, extremely nice, knew everything already, knew the future, importantly, and put three things in my brain for that future that will come out sort of as a time release capsule of consciousness of sorts. And so yeah, I do.
What are those three things?
I don't know. That's what they said before what would happen. They told me how it would happen, what would happen, and they told me I wouldn't have access to that information until it came out. And
Why?
it was I had to agree to
What's
it.
the
I had to
point?
agree to that.
What's the
Well, no,
point of
but think
telling you
about
this
it.
if they lock it up?
Because it needs to be. If they know the future and it's something bad, I would be burdened by that. I would have to carry that with me. And I don't want to know the future. Nobody wants to know when they're going to die or like bad things that are going to happen. Nobody would want that. So maybe it was to protect me. I don't know. I didn't ask them that. They asked me if it was okay if they did this and put these things in my brain and told me specifically I would not know what they were. I would not be able to access them. And I said yes. By this point in this interaction, Ross, it was very clear to me that whatever I was interacting with is very much in control. They took over two people's brains. People were in this room next to us off this balcony. They manipulated their perception and behaviors as well. At one point, three women came out and they had them turn around in unison and walk back in simply by saying, "Can you close the door behind you?" So we're talking about some sort of highly advanced consciousness that is capable of manipulating their brains, putting things in my brain, locking it away that I won't have access to. I'm going to say yes to something like that. I also feel I've been interacting with them in some form or another my entire life. So once that sense of familiarity was achieved, I was on board. I was like, yes, okay, absolutely. Go ahead, do it. Exactly what they said happened. My eyes were wide open. Everything went black. The colors, again, blue and purple being dominant in those, started flooding in. I was at some point as this was happening aware because the woman to my left, Heidi, would occasionally say, "Did you get that? Did you get that?" And I would just kind of go, in the zombie like state. So I saw it coming in at that moment must have had some sense of what it was, but then once it was in my brain, it's completely gone.
Well, Michael, there are a lot of people watching this who may scoff, but I, for one, don't think you're crazy. And I've gone down that same rabbit
You
hole
might be the only
myself.
one. Sometimes I wonder if I'm crazy too. No, I'm kidding. I'm not. And yeah, you're right. We all should self-check, even those of
Yeah.
us who just take this seriously. Maybe we're
There's
crazy just for even looking at this.
one of the things I loved about your paper, just to wrap it up finally, it's a 1691 paper written by a guy called Robert Kirk, a book. It's called The Secret Commonwealth of Elves, Fauns, and Fairies. And when I saw you were quoting from that book, which I've actually had a look at as part of my research, I thought, oh my God, this guy is so brave, even getting into this area to start talking about fairies. But in the book, there is a quotation. And Kirk writes, how much is written of pygmies, fairies, nymphs, sirens, apparitions, which, though not the 10th part true, yet could not spring of nothing. And at the heart of that is an acknowledgement that there must be something to this.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's why I'm so glad that this paper has gotten the attention it has, because we can have these conversations. We can talk about all of those who came before, all of the ones who have written about this, who have brought something that we can start to wrap our heads around if we all look at it holistically. And I think, yeah, there's no one explanation. There's a lot of things going on here, but the more we can just step back, recognize our temporal humility and have a conversation, the farther we'll get faster, I think. So, and conversations like this, I really appreciate you having me on to talk about this and to continue to move the conversation forward.
Well, Dr. Michael Masters, I admire you and applaud you for your intellectual courage. And I think probably in less than a few years, we're going to see an acknowledgement, a coming to terms with the fact that you really did need to be listened to. And I, for one, thank you so much for having the courage and the insight to be able to speak about these things. And thank you for sharing it with Reality Check.
Absolutely, Ross. Thank you. I appreciate that. It means a lot to me.
Thanks for watching. Go to joinnn.com to find NewsNation on your television provider. And please don't forget to click that red subscribe button to ensure you get more of NewsNation's unbiased and fact-driven news coverage.